We're going to talk about the Townsend Acts, kind of review a little bit, and move on, get through this material. Obviously, the Townsend Acts came from some name, and it just happened to be the name of the new man that Parliament decided to give control of the government. It was Charles Townsend, and his job again was to raise revenue in America to help pay for the defense of the colonies and to maybe cut the tax burden on people that lived in Great Britain. And we said that Parliament decided to return to that long accepted method of indirect taxes because the colonists were used to paying those. So these Townsend Acts would put taxes on import duties of basically articles of everyday use, okay, things that people bought. Again, I think Milo said this yesterday when I asked him, the indirect taxes were usually hidden in the cost of the item, so they were easier to pay. And since the colonists had always paid such indirect taxes, Parliament hoped that this would not cause any trouble. So they levied taxes on things like tea and lead and glass and colors for paint and any other necessities or articles of everyday use. And things were hunky-dory, and the colonists probably would have accepted those new taxes, except for Parliament got a little bit paranoid on the idea of smuggling. So they passed a law known as the Writs of Assistance, which were search warrants, and it basically gave these British officials any full power to search anything and anywhere they wanted at any time, which included colonial businesses and colonial ships, colonial homes, and they didn't have to have any probable cause, or they didn't have to state what exactly they were looking for or a specific place. So yesterday we said that because of these writs of assistance, these colonists openly expressed their resentment, and I gave you some examples of what they did to express their resentment. And Will, I'll let you give me one of those things. One of the ways colonists openly expressed their resentment of the Townsend Acts.
They threw snowballs and stones at British soldiers.
No, not yet.
Oh.
They did that during the Boston Massacre. Chantel, what was something that the colonists openly expressed their resentment of the Townsend Acts? What did they do?
The courts refused to issue the writs.
Yeah, the courts, colonial courts, refused to issue the writs. How about another one, Carly? Very good. Colonists refused to obey the Quartering Act. They would not provide living quarters for British soldiers that were sent to enforce the law. Madison, how about another one?
They wrote petitions.
They wrote petitions, resolutions, pamphlets to express their anger. How about another one, Sierra?
Senator Adams wrote a letter to Governor Washington.
Okay, who did he represent?
The leader of Massachusetts.
The legislature of Massachusetts. Yeah, Samuel Adams, representing the legislature of Massachusetts, drafted a letter and sent them to all the other colonies, urging them to unite for resistance against the Townsend Acts. And the Virginia House, or the Virginia Assembly, adopted a set of resolutions that summarized the American case against the Townsend Acts, and that had to begin with an opening statement. Kyle, who did that opening statement?
George Washington.
And what did he state in that?
Only colonial legislators had power to levy taxes.
Right, he was against taxation without representation. He said the only taxes that should be legally put on colonists would be ones that they had the right of say into, okay? Now, we said that many other colonial leaders protested in writing, but the thing they did, I said yesterday, that was kind of important, is they got to thinking about these non-importation agreements that they had dropped when they were complaining about the Stamp Act, and they reenacted those, so to speak, and thinking that was going to really put a crunch on British merchants, and it worked so well with the Stamp Act that they thought it would work again with the Townsend Acts. Now, this is kind of where Will was going. Now, this is what kind of people with a little bit of class or a little bit of power did to express their opposition to the Townsend Acts. What did some more radical Americans do? And go ahead.
They threw snowballs and stones at British soldiers.
They did. They threw stones and snowballs at British soldiers. What else they do, Talon?
They boarded and destroyed British ships.
They boarded and destroyed British ships. How about another one, Shania?
Tarred and feathered people who ran out slavery.
Tarred and feathered people who informed on smugglers. Bailey, how about another one?
The mobs poured into the streets.
Mobs poured into the streets. How about another one there, Taylor?
They attacked British custom officials.
Very good. And what was the last one, Blaine? They went to calling names, name calling. And what'd they call them?
Redcoats, officers.
Bloody backs. Very good. Now, we mentioned that this occurred quite often, but one of the more infamous incidents occurred on March 5th, 1770, when a large crowd gathered in Boston around the soldiers of the 29th British Regiment. The crowd started yelling insults, throwing snowballs at the soldiers, and even though things like this had happened many times before, this one got out of hand because as the mob pressed closer and closer to the soldiers, someone gave the order to fire. 3 civilians were killed and 2 others were mortally wounded, which means they died of their injuries. And one of those was killed was Crispus Attucks, who was a former slave who had escaped from his master 20 years earlier. He'd been free 20 years, and he becomes, in history, one of the first casualties of the conflict or the revolution that we're going to get into. Now, obviously the people of Boston went nuts when they heard of this shooting spread. They called it a massacre. They demanded that all British troops be withdrawn from their city. And what cooled some of their feelings on that a little bit, Kylie? How did the people of Boston get settled down a little bit?
The British government put the soldiers on trial for murder.
They did, very good. The British government put the soldiers on trial for murder that were responsible. They were defended by Josiah Quincy Jr. and John Adams, who were really very good, loyal Americans, so to speak. And people wonder, well, why in the world would they represent? Because John Adams actually became president of the United States because both men felt they had a right to a fair trial. They weren't sympathetic for him, but they thought they had a right to a fair trial. Now, we mentioned that all except 2 soldiers were acquitted of any crime, and the 2 that were found guilty were convicted of manslaughter, but were released soon afterwards. And Blaine made a good point. How did 2 guys kill 5 people, especially with the type of weaponry they used in those days? And that was kind of the point. The point was they let them go, but it still did cool feelings a little bit because at least they tried it. Okay, today we're going to talk about the Townshend Acts are repealed. Well, in 1770, the British Parliament picked another Prime Minister, a guy by the name of Lord Frederick North. In 1770, Lord Frederick North became the new Prime Minister of Britain. Lord Frederick North became the Prime Minister of Great Britain in 1770. Now, when Lord North assumed control of the Parliament, the gap between the American colonists and the British government was what? Very wide. Okay, there was a lot of conflict, and the bridge between the 2 groups was very wide. They weren't getting along at all. So Lord North kind of assumes control of the Parliament at a bad time because he's got a serious gap between the American colonists and the British government that he's got to try to fix. So he urges Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. Lord North urges Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts. And he had one good reason why. He had a main reason, so to speak, why he thought they should do it. What worked again? The non-importation agreements were killing the businesses of British merchants. So the new Prime Minister urged Parliament to repeal the Townshend Acts mainly because the non-importation agreements were once again ruining the business of British merchants. What else might be cost? You know, they're trying to raise money, but actually they're spending money to do what? Enforce the acts. So also the cost of enforcing the Townshend Acts was proving much too heavy for Great Britain, and it wasn't making any sense. So in 1770, Parliament took Lord North's advice, and not only did they repeal the Townshend Acts, they allowed the Quartering Act to expire. Okay? So because of the cost of enforcing the Townshend Acts and the fact that the non-importation agreements were killing British merchants, Parliament agreed to not only repeal the Townshend Acts, but they also allowed the Quartering Act to expire. Lord North was not a stupid man. This really brought the American colonists and the British Parliament closer together. It didn't completely close the gap, but it certainly made good speed to get it closer together. He was trying to work with the colonists. Well, I don't understand these British fellows because they have a pretty good relationship with the colonists for about 3 years, and then they pass another act that almost brings the American colonists to the brink of rebellion. Anybody want to know what that act they passed? The Tea Act, which is our next subtopic, the Tea Act of 1773. Now, they passed the Tea Act of 1773 for the wrong reason. You'd think they would pass it because they needed revenue, right? Well, they did need revenue, but when the Townshend Acts were repealed, the British government insisted on retaining some tax as a symbol of its power to say, well, we can tax you if we want to. They didn't want the colonists to think that they were going to win every, opposition. So basically, they passed the Tea Act just to let colonists know that, yeah, we do have the power to tax you because you are British citizens living in America. So when the Townshend Acts were repealed, the British government insisted on retaining a duty or tax as a symbol of its power to tax the colonies. This time they simply put the tax on tea. And it really was a very small one. It didn't amount to much. It was the point. The colonists refused to pay it because they didn't like the way it was presented to them. So if I said to you, listen, we're going to try to buy these new AP study guides for the summer, and they cost $29.95, and I want you just to pay the 95 cents and I'll pay the rest, and by God, you're going to take these books home and you're going to study them or I'm kicking you out of this class at the end of the year. Well, you might take offense to that. And even though the book only cost you 95 cents, you're going to refuse to pay it because you don't like the way it was presented to you. That's kind of what they're doing here. Now, not only did they refuse to pay the tax on tea, what else did they do?
Boston Tea Party?
Well, we're not there yet. They refused to what?
Buy
Buy the tea. Thank you. Yeah. So the tax was a small one, and not only did the colonists refuse to pay it for the principal, they also refused to even buy any tea from England at all. Here's a way not to pay tax on tea. Don't buy any. Right? Parliament, I don't know what they're thinking of some of this. Well, the East India Company of England was the big tea supplier around the world at the time. The East India Company. They were the one that were supplying the biggest amounts of tea around the world. So they're the company that would be importing tea into America. Well, if they keep bringing tea over and the colonists choose not to buy it, what's going to happen to this tea that they keep bringing over? Well, not so much go bad. It's just going to be piling up in warehouses. So the East India Company has warehouses in America where they bring their tea in and then they sell it, right? Well, if they're not buying, all that's happening is these warehouses are just getting full and more full and more full of unsold tea. So because of the large amounts of unsold tea brought to America, it was piling up in the East India Company's warehouses. Well, the East India Company was worried about bankruptcy because they weren't selling any tea. And so who did they turn to try to get some help? Parliament. Very good. So faced with the possibility of bankruptcy, the East India Company turned to Parliament for help. Now, why would Parliament want to help the East India Company? What would be the point of that? Well, why? For small tax. Why would Parliament maybe support the East India Company? Okay.
They want to keep order. They don't want to back
They're
down.
concerned about revolution?
Well, you know what? You guys won't buy my AP books, will you?
No.
So I'm going to go talk to Mr. Smith about giving me a hand. Mr. Smith is very eager to help me because he's a stockholder in my books. In other words, he bought the books for me, And if you don't pay for them, what happened to all those books?
He hasn't made any money.
Yeah, they're gonna stack up in his office. And so a lot of these members of parliament were stockholders in the East India Company. And they were going broke, so they were eager to help, okay? So many of the members of parliament owned stock in the East India Company, so they were quick to act when the East India Company turned to them for some help. Okay, now I'm gonna try to explain this to you. Because they were about broke, Parliament gave the East India Company a large amount of money to survive. Then they passed a law saying that the East India Company did not have to go through wholesalers. Okay? Now I'm gonna try to explain that to you. So, you got the East India Company here. They're in England. They're gonna come across the ocean to America, and they're gonna pull in the harbor, and they're gonna put their tea in their warehouses. Now, who did the East India Company sell their tea to? They sell it straight to the colonists?
No.
They sell it to merchants, okay? So the tea should go to merchants, and then what do the merchants do? Sell it to the colonists, right? So, these guys make some money, I'm just putting them, so this guy sells a batch of tea to the merchants for $10, and he only paid $3 for it, so he makes, this is a bad example, I just make, so he makes $7 on the deal, right? Okay, the merchant then sells it to the colonists for $17, and he makes $7 on the deal, right? Well, what this law stated that Parliament put out is that these guys didn't have to go through these guys anymore, they just went to these guys. Oh yeah, and who didn't make any money?
The merchants.
Merchants, okay? Now the merchants were okay not making any money when the colonists weren't buying any tea because they were part of the protest, right? But when the colonists started purchasing tea or had the possibility of purchasing tea, and do you think that these guys maybe sold it for less than $17? See, they didn't mess with the middleman here, so they probably sold the tea for $12. They still make $5, but who doesn't make any? The merchants, colonial merchants. What's that?
If they sold it for 12 and they got it for 3, that's 11 months.
Well, I'm sorry. Okay, 9. But you get the point, right?
They're making bank.
I'll continue to say that I'm a perfect example of how you can be a stunning success in life and have no mathematical skills whatsoever. However, the point being is that there's no middleman. These guys say, well, God, if I can buy that for 12 instead of 17, that'll save me some money. And these guys are still making good money, and these guys are making none. Okay? So, what happens is local colonial merchants can no longer compete because of the low prices offered on tea to the colonists directly from the East India Company. Now again, there's no middleman, but the merchants were happy not to be making a bunch of money on tea when the colonists weren't what? Buying it. But if they're going to be driven out of business if tea's sold over their heads, so to speak. Well, there were some colonists that were sympathetic to the business owners, right? Not everybody took advantage of that situation. I'm going to tell you remind me to tell you a story that happened at Billings West High School of the middleman getting cut out on a deal. Anyway, so because colonists were sympathetic to business owners, here's some of the things they did. They loved this. They rioted in the streets. These are colonists sympathetic to business owners and how they reacted to the Tea Act. Okay? They rioted in the streets. They loved doing that. They continued their boycott of English tea. Colonists that had already purchased tea put it in damp cellars so it would rot. Okay? Colonists who had bought tea stored it in damp cellars so it would rot. What do you think had happened when a ship and a cargo of tea came into the harbor?
Raided.
Burned it up, actually burned it up. And in Philadelphia and New York, British ships were even blocked from entering their seaports. They didn't even let the British ships with tea on them come into the seaports. So they rioted in the streets, they continued their boycott of English tea. They stored the tea they already had in damp cellars so it would rot. Ships and cargo of tea were burned up, they'd set the ships on fire. And in two particular colonies, Philadelphia and New York, British ships were blocked from entering the seaports altogether, didn't even let them in. Well, in Boston, they even went a little farther. Because late in 1773, what did colonists do? They disguised themselves and they destroyed 342 chests of tea valued at many thousands of dollars in today's prices. And they dumped them where? Into the Boston Harbor. And these were English ships' tea, so to speak. Okay? So in Boston, late in 1773, colonists disguised themselves and destroyed 342 chests of tea valued at many thousands of dollars in today's prices.
Wait, how many?
342 chests, and a chest would be like one of those old chests maybe your mom has. Thousands of dollars in today's money. I mean, a lot of money. They destroyed them and dumped them into the harbor, right? And that event in history became known as the Boston Tea Party. Now I want to make a point that not all colonists thought that was great. Some thought it was wonderful to destroy all this tea. Others were really kind of shocked at what the people had done. So for the first time here, you're